That night, the rain started just after sunset. The little hilltop chapel where we were holding my great-uncle Raymond's funeral looked almost peaceful under the drizzle, its windows glowing dimly against the darkening sky. Most of the relatives left early because the road down the hill would get slippery when it rained. I volunteered to stay overnight in the small guest house next to the chapel to help the caretaker in the morning. I thought nothing of it at the time. I'd stayed alone in unfamiliar places before. The caretaker, Mr. Howard, locked the chapel door in front of me and handed me a heavy brass key. He smiled and said in his low, scratchy voice, "These old walls like to creak after dark. Don't let them spook you." I laughed, nodded, and watched him drive away into the rain. Inside the guest house, the smell of old wood and flowers from the funeral lingered. There was a small desk lamp throwing a warm circle of light, and beyond the window, the pine trees swayed in the wind. The soft tapping of rain on the glass was almost comforting. I sat on the bed reading until close to midnight, then turned off the lamp. At some point I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I heard was a single slow creak, the sound of the chapel's big wooden front door moving. For a moment I thought I'd dreamed it. Then came another sound, footsteps. Not hurried, not random, but slow, steady, as if someone was walking the chapel aisle. I held my breath and sat up in the dark. The storm outside had grown heavier. The rain on the roof almost drowned the faint steps. Almost. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my jacket, and went to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could just make out the chapel door. It was slightly open, swaying with each gust of wind. A flash of lightning lit up the hill for a brief second, and in that instant I saw a figure inside the chapel. It was tall, wearing what looked like a dark suit. The figure stood near the coffin, head bowed, as though in prayer. When the lightning faded, the figure was swallowed by the dark again. My first thought was that Mr. Howard had returned for something. But why would he stand there, motionless, in the middle of the night without turning on the lights? The thought of anyone standing still in the dark that way made my stomach knot. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the guest house door and stepped out into the rain. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, loud against the constant patter of water. As I crossed the short path to the chapel, the air grew colder, sharper. The heavy front door gave a long, low groan as I pushed it open. The smell of damp lily filled the air, just as it had during the service. Inside, everything was quiet. My flashlight beam slid across the empty pews and stopped on the closed coffin, draped in white flowers. No one was there. "Hello," I called softly. Only my own voice came back, faint and hollow. Another flash of lightning lit the windows for a split second. And in that split second, the tall figure was there again, standing at the coffin. When the darkness fell back, the space beside the coffin was empty. I felt the air grow strangely cold. Every breath turned into a little puff of mist in front of me. I took one cautious step forward, then another, listening for the slightest movement. The chapel was so quiet I could hear the rain running down the gutters outside. Just as I reached the front pew, the flowers on the coffin shifted slightly, as if stirred by a draft, but there was no draft. That was enough for me. I slowly backed away, turned, and almost ran back through the rain to the guest house, slamming the door behind me. I stayed awake for the rest of the night in the corner of the room, flashlight on, heart still thudding. When dawn finally came, the storm passed and the hilltop looked ordinary again under the soft gray light of morning. Mr. Howard arrived soon after sunrise. Trying to sound casual, I asked him, "Did you come back to the chapel last night?" He looked genuinely puzzled and shook his head. "No, I locked it right after you went inside. Nobody goes in there after dark." I didn't say anything else. I just nodded. Even now, whenever I hear the first distant roll of thunder at night, I remember that rain-soaked chapel on the hill, the coffin of my great-uncle Raymond, and the tall, silent visitor who seemed to come back one last time to stand watch in the storm.
It was the summer I turned 22 when I got a part-time job at a small funeral home in a quiet countryside town. My job was simple: help with flower arrangements, guide visitors, and keep the chapel tidy for services. I didn't expect much excitement. In fact, the quiet routine was comforting, until the night we held the wake for a man nobody seemed to know. The man's name was listed as Elliot Graves, but the director told me there was no family who came forward. Only a few signatures appeared in the guest book: neighbors, a postman, and one co-worker. On the evening of the wake, a gentle summer rain began to fall. The smell of wet soil drifted in through the slightly opened windows. The chapel was softly lit by wall sconces that left corners in comfortable shadows. I was told to stay until midnight in case anyone came late to pay respects. Around 9 p.m., the last two visitors offered a quick prayer and quietly left. I swept the foyer, straightened the hymn books, and checked the guest book again. Empty pages stared back at me. The silence felt heavier than usual. At around 10:30 p.m., while I sat at the small reception desk reading a paperback, I heard the front door click open. I stood up, expecting another neighbor seeking shelter from the rain. But when I looked toward the doorway, I saw a tall man in a long black coat. He stood just inside, rainwater dripping from his hat onto the mat. His face was partly hidden by the brim, but I noticed his posture: very still, hands folded neatly in front of him. I greeted him softly. "Good evening, sir. Are you here for Mr. Graves?" He only nodded once, slow, deliberate, then stepped past me toward the chapel hall without another word. The way his shoes barely made a sound on the polished floor sent a faint chill through me. I followed at a respectful distance, keeping my voice gentle. "If you'd like to sign the guest book, it's right by the entrance," I said. He didn't seem to hear me. He stopped at the coffin and stood completely still, head slightly bowed, as if in prayer. I decided to give him privacy and returned to my desk. For a while, the only sounds were the soft patter of rain and the faint creaks of the old building. I went back to my book, trying to ignore the growing weight of silence. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Curiosity got the better of me. I quietly peered down the hallway to see if the man was still there. The space in front of the coffin was empty. Thinking he might have left unnoticed, I went to check the foyer, but the door was still locked from the inside, the way I had left it after the earlier guests departed. A strange unease crept over me. I walked back to the chapel hall. The flowers lay undisturbed, the candles flickered calmly, and then I noticed something that made my heart jump: a trail of water droplets, leading away from the coffin toward the far corner of the hall, and stopping in front of the tall, unlit window. The droplets ended there, as if the man had simply vanished. I whispered, "Hello, sir." The sound of my own voice in the stillness made me shiver. I reached for the light switch, but the nearest lamp flickered before I touched it once, twice, then glowed steadily again. Feeling my pulse quicken, I decided not to linger and returned to the front desk. I tried focusing on the clock. 11:47 p.m., just 13 more minutes until midnight. When the clock's hands reached exactly 12, the chapel bell, which had not been rung all day, gave a single hollow toll. The vibration hummed through the wooden floors beneath my shoes. I looked toward the hall again and froze. Through the thin glass of the chapel door, I saw the tall man standing at the coffin once more, as still as a statue. I hadn't heard a single step. Summoning courage, I opened the door slightly and called out, "We're closing for the night, sir." The man did not move. His head remained lowered, his hat hiding most of his face. I hesitated, then took a step inside. A faint draft brushed past me, though the windows were all closed. The candles nearest the coffin wavered as if stirred by unseen breath. The man slowly lifted his head. Even from where I stood, I sensed something hollow behind that shadowed face. Not anger, not sadness, just an emptiness that made my chest tighten. Before I could say another word, the overhead lights flickered off and on again. In that split second of darkness, the figure was gone. Only the coffin, the flowers, and the softly glowing candles remained. I backed away carefully and stayed at the desk until morning, the rain finally stopping just before dawn. When my supervisor arrived at 7 a.m., I told her about the visitor. She checked the guest book. No new signature. She checked the carpet. No water droplets. The chapel bell rope was still tied up, never touched. All she said was, "You probably imagined it. Long nights can play tricks on you." I didn't argue, but I knew what I saw. A silent guest who came out of the rain to keep a lonely vigil beside a man no one else came for. Even now, I sometimes think about that figure in the black coat, whether he was a stranger paying respect or someone who'd been waiting for Elliot Graves for a very long time. I was never fond of funerals, but I respected the tradition. So when my old school friend Clara passed away unexpectedly, I didn't hesitate to attend her service. It was held at an old riverside funeral chapel on the edge of our hometown, a place I had stepped into since I was a teenager. The chapel was a weathered brick building with tall, narrow windows and polished wooden floors that creaked whenever anyone shifted their weight. Inside, the scent of lilies and candle wax clung to the cool air. Despite the soft, golden glow of the chandeliers, the corners of the room always seemed to stay in shadow. The service itself was peaceful, but heavy with grief. We shared stories about Clara, her easy laugh, the way she always stayed late to help at school events. By the time the last prayer ended, twilight had settled outside, painting the windows in shades of deep blue. Most of the guests left soon after, murmuring polite condolences as they slipped out into the parking lot. A handful of us stayed behind to help the chapel staff gather flowers and fold chairs. It was nearly 8 p.m. when the director thanked us for our help and left us with instructions to close the side doors once we were done. At some point, I realized I was alone. The others had gone out to load their cars with bouquets, promising to return for a second trip, but they never came back in. I didn't mind at first. I liked the quiet. I moved slowly down the aisle between the pews, collecting leftover programs from the service. That's when I noticed it. A faint humming sound, almost like a tune hummed under one's breath, rising from somewhere near the front of the chapel. I froze, straining my ears. The humming was soft, delicate, like a lullaby without words. But the strange part was that it seemed to be coming from beneath the wooden floorboards near the altar. I told myself it was probably the pipes or the river current outside. Still, the sound made the tiny hairs on my arms stand up. I walked up to the altar, kneeling slightly to listen closer. The hum grew clearer, a slow, unbroken melody. It sounded almost familiar, but I couldn't place it. Suddenly the humming stopped, replaced by the faintest whisper, too low to make out words, as if someone was speaking just beneath the floor where I stood. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as though the air itself was waiting. I straightened quickly and laughed nervously at myself, trying to shake the chill crawling across my back. To distract my thoughts, I went to close the tall side doors. The hinges groaned softly as I pushed them shut, latching the brass locks. As I turned back toward the altar, I caught sight of something in my peripheral vision, a ripple of movement across the polished floor, like the reflection of someone passing by, but there was no one else in the room. I decided I'd had enough cleaning for the night and started gathering my things. That was when the overhead chandelier lights began to dim and brighten on their own, as though the power was fluctuating. Yet I could hear no sound of generators or thunder outside. The gentle hum returned, drifting upward again from below the altar. This time, it was joined by the unmistakable creak of wood, slow, deliberate, like footsteps pacing under the floorboards. I stood rooted to the spot, listening. The pacing moved from one end of the altar to the other, then stopped directly beneath where I was standing. The air turned noticeably cooler, and for a second I could see my breath form a pale mist. I stepped back carefully, my heart pounding. "Hello, is anyone there?" I whispered, immediately regretting it. My own voice echoed back at me, making the chapel feel even emptier. Another creak sounded, not from below now, but from the last row of pews at the back of the chapel. I slowly turned my head, my eyes scanning the dim rows of wooden benches. For the briefest instant, I saw a silhouette seated at the far end, a figure hunched forward slightly, as if in prayer. When I blinked, the silhouette was gone. I told myself I was overtired, that the long day had finally gotten to me. I grabbed my coat and hurried toward the exit. My footsteps echoed sharply in the large room, but halfway down the aisle I realized the echo didn't quite match my stride, as if there was a second set of steps following just half a beat behind mine. I didn't look back. I walked faster, my pulse racing, until I reached the door. Just as I reached for the handle, a single soft knock came from beneath the floorboards near the altar. One knock, deliberate and hollow, then nothing. I pulled the door open and stepped into the cool night air, exhaling in relief. The cicadas chirped outside by the riverbank as if nothing strange had happened at all. The next day, I returned to retrieve the jacket I'd left on a pew. Sunlight poured warmly through the tall windows, chasing away the heavy shadows of the night before. The chapel looked entirely ordinary. No flickering lights, no strange sounds. I mentioned the humming to one of the staff members, expecting them to laugh it off. Instead, her expression grew thoughtful. She said, "You know, years ago, before this chapel was renovated, there was a small choir loft beneath the altar. They bricked it up decades back, but some of the older townsfolk claim they still hear singing or humming at night, like the voices of those who used to lead the hymns. I never heard the humming again, but I've avoided staying late at any funeral chapel ever since. Sometimes, when I pass by that riverside building, I remember that night, the flickering chandelier, the echoing steps, and the quiet hum that seemed to rise from deep below the floor, as if the old choir still hadn't quite finished their song."